refresh. Okay, thanks everybody for stay tuned now for part 2 of our show. Sure my sound is off. Okay, thank you for sticking with me. Okay, this is part 2. Okay, now Peter, go ahead and continue with what you were saying.
Sure. I'll start back at December 21st, 2012, exactly what we're facing just about 5 weeks from now. The Mayans are just saying that at this date, that this is not the end of the world, it's the end of a cycle. It's the end of a Mayan cycle. Now, when Mayan cycles end, things have a tendency to change. And what the Mayans are saying is that the next cycle will start on the 22nd, and it's the return, this marks the return of their feathered snake god, Quetzalcoatl. And he's coming back in order to rule. Interesting. And I raised the question, is this the same serpent that's talked about in the Garden of Eden? Are we making another correlation here to some sort of an alien creature? We don't know. We're going to see a very interesting thing this time next year with this comet that's supposed to be coming by, as I mentioned earlier. This comet is supposed to be, or I should say, as I mentioned in the previous show, this comet is supposed to be a once-in-a-civilization's lifetime event. This comet will be seen during the day, and it'll shine brighter than the moon, or at least they're hoping it will. As it passes the sun and comes back, the sun is supposed to turn this thing on like a neon light almost. And so this starts to make correlations in a lot of different prophecies. In the biblical prophecies, we're told that in Acts the 2nd chapter, verse 19, it said that God says that he would give evidence in the heavens above and signs on the earth below. And then it says blood, fire, smoke, mist. The sun will be turned to darkness and the moon will be turned to blood. So the sun wouldn't give its light and the moon is going to look like blood. You ever see, and still those really red moons when they're really close to the horizon typically you'll see them like the harvest moon. As it starts to come up, they look really red or sometimes really orange. It depends on how much pollution is in the air. But there's something that causes this redness of the sun, of the moon, that we'll see. It'll look like blood. There'll be so much red in it, or so much haze between us and it. Now, that's could be coming, because there's also another prophecy in Revelation, the 6th chapter, the 12th through the 17th verses, which John sees something else which kind of resembles what might be a brown dwarf star coming through between Earth and Sun. It could be something totally different, but the account in Revelation says that it starts off with a major earthquake. The earth shakes, it quakes like it's never done before. And then it says that the sun would be turned to as dark as sackcloth or burlap. A lot of people don't know what that material is anymore, but it says as sackcloth of hair. So in other words, the sun you wouldn't see the sunshine. And it says the moon would be turned to blood, would become as blood. And it says that the stars will fall from the heavens like a fig tree shaking loose its figs in a high wind. It goes on to say that the very island, one step ahead of myself. It says that the heavens themselves will be rolled up like a scroll. So if we're looking up at the stars, something's going to come in. And like when you roll a scroll, you no longer see what was printed there. It's not turning a page, it's rolling it back up. So you're rolling that information up. So something is coming across the sky, which is darkening the stars. And it has evidently a lot of debris in it, because we're going to see a lot of shooting stars. This debris is going to come through our atmosphere and light up the night sky with fireworks, essentially.
But Peter, okay, I'm sorry, go ahead.
These are things that are going to be, that could very well be occurring later on in 2013, after we see this comet. Now, with the actual dates, where we come in with this interesting date of the spring equinox, if you go online, there's a lot of strange things that happen. Remember a couple of years ago, people were talking about, it was going to be 10-10-10, and we were going to learn new things, we were going to become enlightened, and then there was the 11-11-11, and then the 12-12-12. And No, it's actually 1221, a backward 12. And I had a friend who was very much into New Age, kept on posting information, and I was like, I got frustrated one day, and I said, well, yeah, I understand 10, 10, 10, 11, 11, 11. I could even understand 12, 12, 12. I said, but what I'm concerned about is 13, 13, and 14, 14. And I said it, I was kind of in an angry mood. I wasn't mad or anything, I was just annoyed. And then I said, why did I even say that? And so I thought, well, let me go check up the the 14, 14 date. And I thought, well, 4, 14, 14 makes sense to me. And I went and I checked it up. I checked it out, and it's like, that date is Nisan 14. Now, that may not mean anything to anybody unless they're Hebrew. Nisan 14 happens to be Passover. Now, that date, Nisan 14, is the Hebrew month of Nisan on the 14th day. It always lands on the first full moon after the spring equinox. The Hebrews used a lunar calendar, not a solar calendar. And the new day started at sundown. So Nisan 14 actually starts on sundown on April 14th, and it ends at sundown on April 15th. Now, the interesting thing about this is that it starts on the 14th of April 2014, and that is a first in history. I could not find any information anywhere that would tell me that Nisan 14 and April 14th from the Gregorian calendar have ever coincided since the existence of the Gregorian calendar. But what's even more interesting is that Nisan 14 ends on April 15th with a full lunar eclipse. It's the first of 4 lunar eclipses, all which happen on Hebrew holidays over the next 18 months. So those two things together make that Nisan 14 or April 14th a very interesting date in the year 2014, which is only 18 months away. Here's the thing. Nisan 14 was the day that Abraham is said to have crossed the Euphrates River to leave for the promised land after he made the covenant with Yahweh. Nisan 14 is the day that the nation of Israel was released from Egyptian bondage, and became their most holy day as the Passover. Nisan 14, Jesus held the Passover with his 12 apostles, and then he dismissed Judas, the unfaithful one, and he held something, a private celebration for him and his faithful 11 apostles, and he called it the Lord's evening meal, and he said, keep doing this in memory of me. And then later on that day, actually on what would be April 15th, Jesus was put to death. Mm-hmm. And so essentially Jesus died on Nisan 14. Now, if Jesus was really coming back, what would be the most logical day for his return?
Probably the 14th.
Nisan 14, I would say. So on Nisan 14, if you think that you need to, I would. I know what I'll be doing. I'll be celebrating the Lord's evening meal, and you can find that account in the scriptures. But here's the thing: there's another prophecy in the book of Ezekiel, and you got to pay attention to prophecies when they start giving exact numbers. And Ezekiel is told to make a brick and write the word Jerusalem on this brick, and then he's supposed to lay on his side facing the brick, and this represents a siege against the city of Jerusalem, and he's supposed to do this for 390 days. Now, here's the interesting thing. If you start off at the spring equinox in 2013 and count 390 days, you land exactly on Nisan 14, 2014. And so now I'm wondering, is it possible that we might see something happen which will change the event of human history come March of this year? Is it possible? People are asking for disclosure. People want to know that not everybody, but those people who are awake want to know, are there really aliens out there? Tell us about the UFOs. We know you got them. We know that something exists that you're not telling us about. Here's an interesting thing. If the governments of the world admitted that extraterrestrials existed, 2 things would change: government and religion. Because if we made alien contact, we wouldn't have individual governments anymore. And they already know this. As a matter of fact, we were put wise to this by Ronald Reagan when he got before the General Assembly of the United Nations back, I believe it was 1982 or 83. You can find it on YouTube, find his speech. Just put in Reagan, United Nations, aliens, and you'll see the YouTube video. You can look it up. And President Reagan, before the whole General Assembly, says, if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world, how quickly we would put our differences aside and unite.
Okay, before we start talking about aliens, because I have a lot of questions about aliens and demons and angels. The other day you told me something about 2014 that possibly, because I was talking about dying and what happens to us after we die, and then you brought up about they can genetically change our DNA so that we don't age and die.
How about that? Yeah, if they're the genetic engineers, guess what? They have the knowledge. They know. Here's an interesting thing. We would not be able to fully understand the scriptures that are written in the Bible until about the last 30 years. And the reason why I say that is that you need to know string theory for a lot of what's going on, and you also need to understand genetic engineering. We wouldn't begin to understand Genesis, especially the account where Eve is made, if we didn't understand genetic engineering. And we didn't discover DNA until I believe it was 1954. So that's when we discovered DNA. Now we had to figure out what it did. It took us 50 years to map the human genome. Think about that. 50 years it took to map the human genome, but now we know pretty much about what DNA is all about. And what they found out is that, well, we don't just have a two-strand DNA. There's a lot of junk strands which don't seem to be connected to anything. Is it possible that when we go back to this account of this tree of duality, this tree of knowledge of good and bad that's talked about in Genesis, is it possible that this fruit had a virus in it that erased part of our genetic code? I actually talked to someone who had their masters in genetic engineering and bioengineering both, and I asked her that question. I said, is there any way to tell if part of our DNA has been erased? Or if that, and she thought about it for a minute, and she said, no, we could never tell if something was missing. And scientists can't figure out, well, they have actually now, but for the longest time, they couldn't figure out why we grow old and die. And the conclusion that they came up with now is that every time the DNA divides and you get a new strand, well, at the end of the DNA, there are these little things called telomeres, and they pop off. And every time, they're like the ends of your shoelace, the little plastic tips. Well, you know what happens when your shoelace, the little plastic tip pops off your shoelace starts to unravel. And essentially, that seems to be what's happening with our DNA. But here's the interesting thing we talked a little bit about the photon belt. They're finding out photons can heal DNA, can repair DNA. And guess what? We got a 2,000-year journey going through the photon belt. So, everything that's being spoken of in the Bible, where it talks about that death will be no more, you mean maybe when we come out of the other side of the photon belt, people won't die anymore?
So that's in the Bible, that death will be no more.
Revelation 21:4 says the tent of God will be made with mankind. Not that we're going somewhere. The tent of God will be with mankind. It's coming here. In other words, something's going on. Something's going to change. We are going to be in a totally healed state. And it goes on to say, death will be no more, neither will mourning, nor outcry, nor pain be anymore. The former things have passed away. So these things are going to be done away with. Well,
but wait a minute, Peter, I have a question about that.
Sure.
If people don't die anymore, what's going to happen to the economy? What about jobs? And will there still be births, but they'll stop at a certain age?
Well, here's the interesting thing. Were we made just to populate this planet? Do you have any idea how many eggs are in a woman's ovaries when she's born? This is wild. This is a wild statistic. Take a guess. Do you have any idea how many eggs? Over 400,000. For over 400,000, yeah. Now, if you passed one egg a month, you would have to live for over 3,300 years to pass them all at one a month. But now, here's a question. What if you only passed an egg once a year? Well, by the time you were done, you'd be 500,000 years old, wouldn't you? We only use about 0.1% of our brain.
Yeah.
And here's the interesting thing. Men never stop making sperm as long as we're alive. We're still making the little swimmers. So right now, we reproduce like rats. But there's an interesting thing, that's mentioned by God in Genesis, the third chapter, I believe it's verse 16 or 17. It says, he's talking to Eve, and he says, because you listened to the serpent, I am going to greatly increase your birth pains, and your craving is going to be for your husband, and he will dominate you. Now, when a woman is most flirtatious and most enamorous, is typically during ovulation. So could it be possible that the ovulation cycle was sped up in humans? Because now we no longer had perfect DNA, we were going to turn around and start dying. And see, that's what this tree of duality did for us.
Okay, so do aliens die?
They're not three-dimensional, so they don't, eventually they may, but they're not, they are not under the same rules and regulations as we are in the third dimension. Here's something to think about. If you traveled at the speed of light, which is physically impossible, but if you traveled at the speed of light from here to Alpha Centauri and back, which is our closest star, your children will have died. The trip takes 4.4 years. So when you got back, you will have aged 4.4 years. Your children will have died of old age, and your grandchildren would be in their 60s or 70s. But you will have only aged 4.4 years. Yeah, think about that. So time is relative here. So we're dealing with life forms that do not adhere to laws within the third dimension as we understand them here on Earth.
And we're the only ones in the third dimension?
To the best of my knowledge, we are the only intelligent life forms created for the third dimension. When our three dimensions were developed, they were developed at least for our expansion. So now, think about the original purpose. Man was seated on the earth, or I say humans were seated on the earth, and they were told to fill the earth. Where do we go when we fill the earth here? And especially if we lived forever. Does that mean we get to go to other planets? How about that? A long time ago, I had somebody tell me, this was back in the 1970s, I had a very old wise man tell me, your future is in the stars. And I didn't exactly understand what he meant at that time, but I do now. You see, our future is actually, really in the stars. We think about things on a lifetime scale, and then we start breaking them down. We break them right down to an I want it now society, and if we can't have it now, we get all upset and frustrated, and our performance slacks off.
So when we die, then what dimension do we go into?
That's a good question, because it sure isn't three-dimensional anymore. I would imagine that we pass through all the dimensions and go right back to Source, right back to Yahweh. When I had my near-death experience, that's pretty much exactly what happened to me. One second I was in my body, the next second I was outside my body. My consciousness and what appeared to be my life force was no longer in my body. I looked kind of like a cloud. Maybe that's where this idea that God floats on a cloud, I don't know. Maybe that's where that came from. But the interesting thing is that this material that I was made out of was being pulled, like I was in a tractor beam, and I was being pulled right into the white light. And I remember thinking, I don't want to die. I knew I was in trouble. Before anything ever happened, I knew I was in trouble. I was looking up at the ceiling as they wheeled me down this hospital corridor, and I can't move, I can't say anything. About the only thing I could do is barely blink my eyes. And there was no way for me to tell anybody what was going on, and the next thing, I'm out of my body. and everything turned from color to black and white. There wasn't, I didn't, it was like looking at an old life outside my body at that point was just black and white and shades of gray. And I was physically being pulled into the giant white light. And as my attention turned from my physical body to looking at where I was going, it was like, well, I guess this is it. It's all over. I'm dead. I'm dead. This is what's going to happen to me. And it was kind of like when I stopped fighting it and I just kind of calmed down in my consciousness, all of a sudden it stopped. I wasn't being pulled in anymore. Everything reversed and I was being pushed away and I was being put back into my own body. And, I never got to the great white light. I never got to beyond that, but I was no longer in the third dimension. I was someplace else. Exactly where, I can't tell you, but it was no longer 3D. It was black space with a bright white light that I was being pulled into.
Wow. Can I just ask you this, because one of my viewers has a question. If we're made in the image of God, and if God is an alien, aren't we aliens?
Yeah, kind of, because, well, you see, here's the thing, yes and no. Our human life form, our body, our three-dimensional life form, is dictated by the very planet in which we live. It's dictated by the gravity and by the environment. Now, if this planet was total water, we couldn't possibly look like we do now. If this planet had a lot more gravity to it, we wouldn't be as tall. If the planet had a lot less gravity, we would be a lot taller than what we are now. So our physical image has been dictated by the environment of this planet. And that's why we can find this fossil record that goes back to Cro-Magnon man and Neanderthal and all the way back, all the way back down to Lucy.
But Peter, there are aliens, and I don't know how all this information comes to us, or how they found out about this. I got on a website today, and they were listing aliens I never heard of before: the blues, the greens, the dragon. I never heard of these before, but there are other aliens that are very human-like, which are the Palladians and the Nordics. So why do they look like us, but they're not on our planet in the third dimension? How can they look like us and be in another dimension?
Well, here's the interesting thing. If you go back to the Book of Enoch, these life forms, and the Book of Enoch is fantastic. The Bible doesn't say much about about Enoch in his life. It just says that the interesting thing, it says he was taken. Now in the Book of Enoch, it goes into much greater detail. That explains where he was taken and what happened after he was taken. In the Book of Enoch, he talks about these watchers. Now these watchers were supposed to watch over mankind's development. They were like our guardian
Now
angels.
who were the watchers? The watchers are they the light people, the light workers?
Well, that blue orb that I had contact, that I had seen 2 years ago, may have very well have been a watcher. I don't know. He didn't leave his calling card, unfortunately. But like I said, that appeared out of nowhere, and it prevented a deer from coming through the windshield of my car, and it disappeared as fast as it came.
That's amazing.
So it was an energy force that I had seen. Now, is it possible that that energy force could have entered my body? And what I was thinking of, because of the timing, the split-second timing of all of this, I wondered about that deer. Could that deer have had an energy force inside of him which drove him out of the woods to decide to jump across the road at the same time my car was passing by? I don't know. It's interesting. This all occurred the same week that I decided to release the information about 2014 as a possible date for the start of Armageddon. 2014, April 4th, 2014, I should say, or April 14th, rather, 2014. Sometime shortly thereafter, we could very well be in this war of Armageddon. Now, what is Armageddon? It's the end of the demonic or the alien rule of this prison planet. Let's look at history. Since the Anunnaki came to the land of Samaria, to Mesopotamia, humans have worshipped these godlike creatures. Now, in the book of Enoch, talks about these watchers and how they fathered these men. But Enoch also says that they brought technologies, and they taught the people how to make herbs, and they taught them how to use herbs and roots, and how to produce metals, and how to read the stars and understand astrology and astronomy. They gave them all the technology that we could possibly handle back at that time. There's a strong belief, and there's a lot of whistleblowers coming out of the military, though there has been, I should say, over the years, that talk about this same thing, that the aliens that we have made contact with, whether they were from Roswell or someplace else, that they've been giving the military advanced technology. And the last little blurb that I got from the Galactic Federation of Light, I had to throw that in there, that was on purpose. The Galactic Federation says the same thing, that they've been giving our military advanced technologies. And now we have these advanced weaponry.
Okay.
You know,
Go ahead.
so somebody's giving us the technology.
Okay, Tim wants to know who created the aliens.
Well, you see, these were, in my humble opinion, these are other life forms. Technically, I guess if you want to go to the scriptures, it would have been Jesus, or as he was known back in his pre-human form, Michael. When the Big Bang happened and all 10 dimensions came into existence, the biblical account basically says that the actual first thing that happened was that this life form that we call Jesus, or his pre-human life form, Michael means who is like Yahweh.
You mean Jesus was Michael? Michael the Archangel?
The logical conclusion that I've drawn. Now, a lot of people, especially evangelical Christians, will disagree with me and want to burn me in hell for that statement, but that's okay. They don't like what I say, that God was pure energy at one time either. But what else could he have been? What was he before there was this? If nothing else existed before God, then what was there? It could only have been pure energy.
But one second here. You're saying Jesus was Michael.
Yeah. If you go to Revelation, the 12th chapter, there's a very good indication of that, because it says war broke out in the heavens. And could that be the other 7 dimensions? It says war broke out in heavens between Michael and between Michael and his angels, and the dragon and his angels. And a place wasn't found for them there anymore, and they were cast down to the earth. And it says, woe for the earth, because the Satan has been thrown down to you, knowing he has a short amount of time.
But they're not referring to Michael the Archangel.
I believe they are.
Really?
Well, you see, here's the interesting thing. Michael, which means who is like Yahweh, if you wanted to say, and he said, when Jesus said, if you've seen the Father, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. And a lot of people say, oh, Jesus must be God then. No, Jesus was a human, a perfect human with perfect DNA. Now, the name Jesus, or Yeshua, means salvation is in Yahweh. So in the pre-human, or in his, if you want to call it alien, and I guess you would say Jesus was actually the first alien life form that was created by transformation of energy.
Okay, but wait a minute. We always thought that Michael was an archangel. Now, was Michael a fallen angel?
Absolutely not, no.
So what was Michael then? What was he?
Some people actually turn around and try to make that correlation, but you go back to Daniel, and Daniel in the 10th chapter says he had to get Michael, the foremost one. In other words, there was no one else like him to come and fight the Prince of Persia. And in Revelation, we get the same reference back to Michael and his angels. So we've got somebody who's an authority who is like Yahweh fighting the dragon and the dragon's angels. Or essentially, we've got an alien war going on here.
Okay, so let's clear up a little. The viewers want to know, you are a Christian. You were raised Catholic, weren't you?
I actually wasn't. No, I actually never really had what I would call a normal religious upbringing. It was more of an educational upbringing. So no, I don't adhere to, and still now I don't adhere to any religion. I say that I'm Christian kind of by default, because I do put my faith in Jesus as being the savior for this planet. And I do believe he's coming back with an army to fix this mess that we're in now.
Okay, and then for those that came in late, Peter he started reading the Bible at age 5. So everything he is quoting is from the Bible. Everything is in the Bible.
Now, here's the thing. Some people have spent their whole life studying the Mayan cultures. Some people spent their whole life studying the Egyptians. Some people have spent their whole life digging up rocks in the dirt and putting meaning to them. I could have done any of those, but I had an early advance on learning the Bible, and so what I did was I studied the Bible. But I didn't just study it from a theological viewpoint. I studied it from a scientific viewpoint.
Okay, so how can you study the Bible on a scientific? Now, Tim is saying the Bible's completely open up to interpretation. Is that what you make of it?
Not exactly, because how do you interpret... Well, let's go back to the account of Genesis, where we have our first case of genetic engineering. How do you interpret what happened there any other way than it had to be done by genetic engineering? If you remove a tissue sample from one person and you put it and you take that tissue sample and you develop it and grow it into another person, well, we can do that here on Earth. We call it cloning, but we don't change the sex. It's an exact duplicate of the first
Right.
body that we took the tissue sample from. There was actual genetic engineering going on, because it wasn't, Adam didn't meet Adam, or Adam didn't meet Steve, Adam met Eve. And so it was a woman, and he says, because from man you were taken. Interesting. So Adam even knew that Eve had been genetically engineered for him. They didn't use the term genetically engineering. But one of the problems I have with the Bible, it's a need-to-know book, and it doesn't use technological terms. In the book of Enoch, when he's talking about these extraterrestrial life forms, when he's taken, he says that these life forms had the ability to turn from the form of fire to the form of man and back to the form of fire at will. So they could turn from an energy source to looking like a human and then back to this form of fire or this energy source at will. That would tell me that they weren't bound to the laws of the third dimension as we are.
Okay, so, because you're so interesting and you have so much information, we're at this point now where people are going to start asking you questions. So I'm just going to interrupt you. Is that okay? All right.
Yeah, that's great. I just want to point out one other thing. Now, it's things that are open up to interpretation. When I was talking about the trumpet blast from Revelation chapter 8, I would say that's open to interpretation. And when you look at the results from those trumpet blasts that happen, are we not seeing forest fires on an unprecedented scale around the whole globe? Have we not seen the Gulf oil disaster, which seems to fit what John says in Revelation 8, chapter 8 and 9 about a great burning mountain being thrown into the sea? Are we not seeing the pollution of our drinking water by Fukushima and by Chernobyl? Well, it used to be Chernobyl that polluted a lot of stuff. Now it's Fukushima. Over a year and a half, and this thing is still cooking away in a meltdown, and they can't stop it, or maybe they won't stop it. The other trumpet blast is a third of the sun would be darkened, and a third of the moon would be darkened, and a third of the stars also would not give their light. And today we have chemtrails which are darkening the sky from coast to coast and even around the world. They're spraying chemtrails so we can't see what's out there anymore. It's reduced the amount of solar radiation that's actually hitting the Earth. The White House has actually come out and said this. They have an actual Office of Science in the White House, and it's called weather modification. And what they claim they're trying to do is slow down the amount of solar radiation which is causing global warming. So they've even come out and admitted it themselves that they're spraying chemtrails. Now you can say, well, that's not the right interpretation. Okay, I can't argue if you've got a different interpretation for that, but tell me something that's more logical that we've seen happen here in the past several years. Jesus said there'd be earthquakes in one place after another. earthquakes have gone up in the past 15 years. They've gone up over 700%. And no, it's not just better recording data. It's actually major earthquakes have gone up over 700% in the last 15 years. That, I would say that's significant. We've had, in the past week, we've had 6 earthquakes, 4 up from Chile all the way up to Alaska. We had 4 of them. And we had 1 over in Myanmar in the Far East, and what was the other one? Was it Indonesia? I forget what the 4th one was. That was over 6. And the news isn't even reporting these things. Unless there's death and devastation somewhere, the news isn't reporting the amount of earthquakes that are going on. If you go to USGS, in a month's time, we have about 7,000 earthquakes around the world.
Wow.
Go to their map. Virtually any time you go and look at the earthquakes for the last week, and you'll be surprised how drastically it changes. Look at that swarm that we had in Southern California last month. There were over 800 earthquakes in Southern California.
Wow.
The swarm that we had off the coast of Canada, there was actually what was it, a 7.1 off the coast of Canada, or 7.2, whatever we recorded that at the same time Sandy was hitting. It was the Friday before Sandy came ashore. That actually turned out to be over 80 earthquakes. 80 earthquakes the last time that I saw in 1 week struck that same area.
Wow.
Yeah, we can't deny it. Earthquakes are coming in swarms. It's not just, oh, there was an earthquake there and a few aftershocks. No, there was an earthquake there and 85 aftershocks? That's kind of ridiculous.
Yeah.
And so, we've got these physical things which are all being foretold in the Bible, which we could look at. Now, if you want to give them a different interpretation, go ahead. But after 50 years of studying this book, this is the interpretation that I'm giving them.
All right, Debbie has a question. Adam and Eve had Cain and Abel. Cain killed Abel, so Cain killed Abel, so Cain was as sent to the land of Nod and begotten the wife. My question would be, where did those people come from?
That's an interesting question, and I was asked this not all that long ago, and I went back and read the account, and it's interesting. Now, if you look at the Bible is not a full record of everybody that was born. As a matter of fact, in most cases, it only looks at the male lineage. It goes by the sons of Adam. It doesn't say anything about his daughters. But now, Adam is said to have lived for 936 years. Out of that 936 years, it doesn't say how long Eve lived, but let's say out of 600 years, producing 1 egg a month, how many kids could you have? Quite a few, I'd say, wouldn't you?
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't just Cain, Abel, Seth, and whoever else is mentioned in that, but there were also daughters involved. Now, it's interesting, the account says that when Cain left, he actually eventually stopped and he built a city. Why would he build a city if it was just him and his wife? So by the time he got to wherever he was going, he built a city for the people that were with him. More than likely, his children, and his grandchildren, and his great-grandchildren. You see, that's why I said the Bible is a book of need-to-know information. It's only the stuff that we really need to know that's written in there.
Well, Tim says, but you're applying modern-day interpretations of science to spiritual teachings.
Yep. And there's an exact reason why I do that. And I started off by saying, in my own mind when I did this, I said, there are no miracles in science. There are no miracles in science. There's only things that we don't understand yet. We may not know what's in a particular formula, but if we keep on looking and we keep on examining, we can start to figure this stuff out. And that's what science is all about. And you have to admit, our universe runs, we set our atomic clocks by the movements of the universe. If there is not science involved in the very movements, the gravitational pull, the interaction between, from the very atoms that molecules are made out of, right on up to galaxies, they all work in synchronization. As a matter of fact, what they're finding is the same principles that are applicable on an atomic level also work at the black hole level. The same gravitational forces that are at work on an atomic level work on a galactic level. Now, that's not me saying it, that's science saying it. So there's got to be science behind all of this. When you look at the numbers that are talked about in the Bible, the number for spiritual completeness is 7. Oh, lucky number 7. That seems to be God's number, 7. Man's number is 10. We have 10 fingers, 10 toes. A lot of the parables in the Bible had to deal with 10, the parable of the 10 virgins and the parable of the 10 talents. It was earthly completeness. So if spiritual completeness is 7 and earthly completeness is 10, let's see. Could we be talking about that we need to have those 7 godly dimensions in order for our 3-dimensional world to exist? Well, string theory would bear that out. String theory would say, yeah, because we can't be here without 7 other dimensions that we don't even know about. And the wild thing is, Dr. Mikio Kaku, he's funny sometimes. He put this very succinctly. He said, it's possible that in another dimension, a T-Rex could be running right through our living room right now, and we would never know it because it exists in another dimension. And I thought, really? Does that mean we can be running through God's living room right now and not even know it because we exist in a different dimension? You see, there's too many questions with unanswered that go unanswered with exact proof. So we have to look at the logicalness of how it works. Now, I'm not handing out any kind of church dogma here. I'm not telling you to believe a certain way. What I'm saying is that what these situations are that are happening, looking at them at a physical level here on earth, these prophecies, these last day prophecies are all playing out. But it's just the end of this system. It's not the end of the world. The world, I believe is it Isaiah? I believe it's written in that the earth will be here till time indefinite. I believe Solomon said the same thing. He said a generation is coming and a generation is going, but the earth is going to be here till time indefinite.
Okay,
it's
well,
not going anywhere.
Tim is saying, let alone genetic engineering, I don't think they would even understand the concept.
Well, you know, Adam understood something. He said, at last, this is flesh of my flesh and bone of my bones. This one was taken from man. I will call her woman. That tells me he got the concept. Now, he may not have understood the exact method of how it was done. He may not have been a genetic engineer. You know, I'm not a genetic engineer. I wouldn't know the first thing about how to go about genetic engineering anything. But you know what? I can go to school and I can get my master's. I can get a doctorate degree in genetic engineering now. I could tell you, if I wanted to put the time and grade into it, I could go to some of the best universities in the world and learn genetic engineering. Anyone can if they can afford the tuition, because we can do that now. We have that ability. That's why I said the Bible lacks scientific or technical terms. I mean, chariot of the gods. What's a chariot of the gods? What's God's chariot? Was it a UFO?
Yeah.
Was it something, you know?
That's what I think.
If you pulled up with a Ferrari right in downtown Israel in the 1st century, they would say, wow, that's a chariot of the gods.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know? Go land in a helicopter in the middle of Egypt while they were building the pyramids, and they'd say, the gods have arrived.
So what do you think see, we're all really curious about the aliens, and one of the viewers mentioned crop circles and Area 51, but Area 51 is a government thing. Do you know anything about Area 51? What's going on?
Well, just things that I've heard, you know, kind of along the way here, pretty much things that everybody else has. I've never worked out there. It's been a very secret base. I know this much I can tell you. It seems like they've moved a lot of what they were doing, the real secret stuff, out of Area 51 and moved it up to Dugway Proving Ground. Now, I did go online a couple of years ago. I was watching UFO Hunters. And they had an episode about Dugway. And they said, oh, well, we can't get into Dugway, we can't see anything, you know, we were sitting at the gate and security came and started talking to us. Okay, whatever. Where's Google Earth? Boom, 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 boom. Google Earth, let's zoom in on Dugway. You know what I found at Dugway? There's a structure that sits northwest of Michael's Air Force Base. And you can zoom in on it. It looks like a big bullseye. It looks like a dartboard.
Now, where's Michael's Air Force Base?
On Dugway Proving Ground. What's it, in Utah or Nevada? I think it is.
Yeah.
When you look at this thing and get right into it with Google Earth or Google Maps, you see that there's a structure in the center of right in the center of this thing that looks like a target or it looks like a bullseye. When you get right down to the bullseye, you see something that looks a lot like what's called the fly trap that the Nazis were using in their Bell project back during the Second World War, only it's bigger. Now, what they believed the Nazis were doing was tying down this anti-gravity machine, trying to get to learn to fly it, and it was essentially tied down to what they call the fly trap, and it was a circular structure that kind of looked like arches all the way around, and it was probably about 20 or 30 feet high, all made out of concrete. When you go to this image that you can see on Dugway Proving Grounds, it's about 200 feet across and probably about 100 feet high, but it looks a lot like the same thing that Nazi Germany built over in Poland during the Second World War. It looks a lot like the fly trap. I wrote an article about it and posted it a couple of years ago. But so it seems like they're having more of a situation, or they're doing more experimental things over at Dugway now than they are over at Area 51. But who knows, because these places are interlaced with underground tunnels and underground bunkers. It's believed that you can go from Washington all the way across the United States, from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco, California, and never come up from underground.
Let's see, Cheyenne has a question. I've always how come in almost 30 years of working out at night and where the sky is always visible to me, have I never seen a UFO or anything that comes close to it? Now, how come some people are seeing UFOs and others aren't?
I have no clue. I have a good friend of mine. He retired from the Air Force not too long ago. He was in the Air Force for 20 years. I asked him straight out, I said, have you ever seen a UFO? Nope. He didn't even hesitate. You know, it's not like there was something that he knew that he didn't want to tell me. He said, I'll tell you the strangest thing that I did see, and he went on to tell me a story about a pilot that he was a flight engineer. And he was telling me about this pilot who was flying a transport jet 20 feet off the water, 20 feet off the ocean. So, you know, that was the most wildest thing that he'd ever seen. So some people just don't. You know, from that one first incident that happened when I was 18 years old, I'd never seen a UFO until until this past summer, actually. And I wouldn't say that it was an alien UFO. I think it's probably something more military. There was something, I was looking up at the sky one night and I saw a flash, and I was like, what was that? And so I focused in on where the flash was, and I'm looking in that general area for another flash, and sure enough, I see another flash, and I'm looking at this tiny, tiny, tiny little white spot, and it's moving across the sky, and all of a sudden it flashes again, and now it's changing direction. And now I'm watching it change direction, and it's no plane, it's way, way up too high to make a plane, there's no other lights, you just see this little white flash every once in a while, and every time it flashes, it changes direction. I'm like, that's odd, and I made mention of that on my Facebook page, and I had somebody else turn around and say, yeah, I've seen the same thing several times. And now I actually, it was about 3 weeks ago, I saw it again. We were standing outside looking up in the sky, and boom, there was that flash.
Yeah, I've seen that.
So my thought is, most logically, it was some military DARPA experiment or something that we've created that's up there that we're not telling anybody about. NASA was the storefront for the real technology that's developed by the military in their secret bases. We're supposed to have aircraft which is so advanced, we're supposed to be able to make it to Mars in a matter of hours with this aircraft. So the whole Mars project, or the whole Mars mission through NASA is nothing but a storefront joke.
Wow. Debbie wants to know, Debbie says, Peter, what about City of Atlantis and the UFOs? Did we mix breed?
You know, I've looked at the evidence on the city of Atlantis, and there really isn't any. It's more myth than legend. I mean, or more myth or legend than anything that we can actually find. And most of everything that we know about Atlantis comes from Plato. And so we get this extra information. A lot of it seems to be channeled from extraterrestrials, perhaps, or some other life forms. But I've looked at Atlantis as logically as I could, along the lines of, was there an advanced race there? Could it have been an alien base? And I think, if life on Earth was genetically engineered, they needed a laboratory somewhere to do the genetic engineering. So, yeah, very possibly, Atlantis could have been the base that they came in genetically engineered from. If you go back to the movie Jurassic Park, and I'm not saying that this is real or anything, but we'd love it to be real if we can bring back dinosaurs, as long as we didn't bring them into the country. But they had their park set up, which was their amusement area, but the real work was done on another island where they were doing all their genetic engineering. I thought that was an interesting situation. So, when you go from the physical or from the non-physical world or the other dimensions and come into the physical world, how many flowers do we have? If you were a genetic engineer and I gave you the assignment to make flowers, said use your imagination, right? How many flowers can you make? How many birds can you make? What's the difference between a hummingbird and a condor or an American bald eagle? They're both birds, but look, you never see one that tends to crossbreed with the other. They're separate. And just like every other bird species, they're always breeding with their own kind. How many different genetic varieties do we have of birds? So it had to be done somewhere. It had to be done somewhere to bring this information into the physical world. Was it Atlantis? It very well could have been. Will we ever find Atlantis? I don't know. Is it really important that we do find it? No. What's it going to do? We'll find a bunch of ruins. Oh, look, it did exist. There's some speculation as the possible Minoans as being the original area for Atlantis. There's some other work that's going on just past the Gibraltar Strait as you're going out toward the Atlantic Ocean. On the coast of Spain, they're finding another area that they believe might be Atlantis. You have the Bimini Road, which Edgar Casey talked about as Atlantis would be found in the Bahamas, and so they think that might be part of it. But what are we going to find? What are we going to find if we do find Atlantis? It's one of those things that really, it would be nice to know, it would be nice to have it from antiquity, but will we ever find it? And will we ever find their ancient technologies? Probably not.
Chicky, Peter did touch on the Hurricane Sandy, and do you want to tell them about that just really briefly, Peter? She came in late and doesn't know what you said about Sandy. And then Tim said, wasn't there another perfect storm? I don't know of another perfect storm except they called that one out in the East Coast when there was this that huge storm that happened when that ship went down. But was there another Sandy anywhere in our time?
Technically, not that I'm aware of, or technically no. However, it's interesting. There's some information just came to me both yesterday and today. Back in 1993, they had a hurricane drill in New York. Actually, it was in Westchester County, which is the next county up from the New York metropolitan area. And they had a drill in case of a hurricane hit. And then they named the hurricane in their drill Sandy. Interesting.
Yeah.
Now, here's the thing about Sandy. When they started playing the models for this, Sandy didn't even get to Cuba yet. And they were saying, oh, it's going to come up along the east coast of America, and then it's going to make a left-hand turn and go inland once it gets to New York City. And I was like, how do they know this a week before it happens? And today I came across seismic activity that was recorded while Sandy was tracking. There was seismic activity recorded all inland from Sandy, from Florida, all the way up to Chicago. And when Sandy was developing, I was there's an actual website that you can go on, and we talked about HAARP a little bit earlier.
Yes.
The High Altitude Auroral Project. You can actually go to the HAARP website. It's, I believe, www.harp.com, and you can go to the purpose page. Why do they have HAARP? It's being built for security, or was built for security and communications reasons, is what they tell us. Defense reasons. You can go and you can read this right on their website. And when you look into the capabilities of HAARP, it's a pretty amazing machine, because it's a transmitter. It's a 1 billion watt transmitter that they can shoot an energy beam up into the ionosphere and bounce it off the ionosphere back to Earth. And if they dial in the right frequency, they can cause earthquakes. And what you can see when you start looking at, typically if a HAARP earthquake will be 10 kilometers deep, 6.2 miles. So if you see Haiti was a 6.2 mile or 10 kilometer deep earthquake, and Hugo Chavez turned around and said, "Oh, America's using HAARP to destroy Haiti." He might have been right. But it can also manipulate weather. Where I found out about it was really quite strange. It was right after Hurricane Katrina. There was at a friend's restaurant that I frequented quite often. I was just finished up having dinner, and the bartender's boyfriend happened to be there, and he was waiting for her to finish up for the evening, and they were getting close to closing time. And so we were talking, and I wound up buying him a drink, and he toasted a dead friend, and it was like the most eeriest toast I'd ever heard, and I waited for what seemed to be forever, but it was probably about 30 seconds, and I thought, if I don't ask, I'll never find out. So I asked him what happened to his friend, and he told me, well, he worked up at this place in Alaska that's called HAARP, and he said that he was at the controls when they caused Katrina, when Katrina came into New Orleans. He said that they could have brought Katrina all the way up the Mississippi Valley as far as they wanted, right up to the Canadian border if they wanted. And he explained a little bit of what his friend had told him. Well, his friend was going to release to the press what they had done with Katrina. And the morning he had his meeting with the news people, he left his house, went to go drive to the meeting point, and he was blown up inside of his car.
Oh my God.
Yeah, and now the gentleman who told me this, young guy, early 30s, he got his own business. He's not a conspiracy nut. He wasn't into, all the different things that HAARP could do. He just told me a story that his friend told him, and I did all the legwork to go after that and started investigating HAARP and find out what it could do. And they can create all these things. They can actually transmit a message directly to your head, and you would pick it up by the vibrations in your jawbone, and they can tell you whatever they want, and you wouldn't even know where it's coming from. They say, "This is God talking, listen to me." And they can cover a whole country with it.
Oh my God.
Absolutely. Now think about this. They have flying 747 lasers. It was part of the Star Wars program to stop ICBMs from being launched. These lasers are chemical lasers. They're so powerful that if Russia or China or anybody launched a nuclear weapon and we had one of these planes in the area, it could shoot down the missile. Okay. Well, you know how to make a holograph or a hologram? All you need is 3 lasers pointed together and you can produce a picture. So now just picture 3 747s flying around with these chemical lasers, and they are all pointing their lasers together, and they put a picture of Christ returning. And they use HAARP to transmit a message, and you see this huge giant image of Jesus, and you hear this message, "I am your Savior, I've come back to earth to be with you people." People would freak out around the world wherever they saw this. And there may have already been a taste of this that's happened. There's a YouTube video that's out of the Ivory Coast in Africa, and you can see what appears to be the image of Mary in the sky. And I'm wondering if this isn't made by lasers, and all these people looking at it, they're shouting, they're overjoyed, they see the Mother Mary, and the reaction of the crowd is impressive, because they're showing you this thing which keeps on fading in and out of focus, or what looks like it's fading in and out of focus. It's just how they're developing it, and it looks like the Virgin Mary, what we are told is the Virgin Mary, pictures of. So the technology that they have is so fantastic today, and we can't help but wonder what they're going to do with it.
Debbie has a question. Peter, what about Hitler's secret UFO projects? What's your intake of Hitler's interest in UFOs?
Hitler knew. Hitler knew what was, this is interesting. The Germans had a whole different philosophy of what science is than what the standard thought of what science is. And so they stopped thinking outside of the box to start creating all these other super weapons. Now, what's interesting about Hitler and the Third Reich is that they were very much into the occult. They were trying to dig up the artifacts from antiquity. You got the story about Indiana Jones and Raiders of the Lost Ark. Well, that's actually kind of based on somewhat of truth, because the Nazi armies were digging up, looking for antiquities in Egypt, and they sent ambassadors to Tibet and looking for the Aryan roots, and so there was a lot of interest in the occult. Now, why does the occult always seem to come around with UFOs? So my question is, were they getting specialized knowledge from the gods, or from aliens, or from other life forms which gave them this technology to help them think out of the box? It's hard to say, but there's no doubt the Nazis came up with the bell somewhere, and after the Second World War, we seemed to scap up a bunch of them. It's believed over 3,000 scientists were brought to America from Nazi Germany under Operation Paperclip. The best known scientist was Wernher von Braun, who was in charge of NASA. It was Wernher von Braun's rocket designs that put the United States on the moon. And interestingly enough, von Braun gave us a warning. And von Braun said that they were going to, and this was about forming a one-world government. He said first they're going to use the deception, or he called them cards, the communist card. And we had this Cold War up until the Berlin Wall fell, and communism fell right behind it. And he said that we would have, there would be the terrorism card. And so then we had terrorism, and we all know what happened on 9/11. And let's see, then there would be the rogue nations. And so we were told about the axis of evil. And then he said that we would have extraterrestrial bodies, comets and asteroids, things like that. And so NASA's developed the Space Watch program, where they're trying to track all of these rogue comets or rogue asteroids that are, may hit the Earth at some time. They're trying to get them all numbered and labeled, just in case. So, and the next step is to develop weapons to stop them from hitting Earth. We know that they've hit Earth lots and lots of times before, and chances are they'll hit Earth again. And he got to the last card. He said, and the last card will be the alien card. The alien card? You mean we're going to see aliens? We're going to have an alien invasion? Yeah, there's a strong possibility. Now, I'd have to think that the head Nazi scientist of NASA would have an idea of what was going on. And this was like kind of a deathbed confession that he did.
Now, Peter, we talked about 911 the other day. Do you want to tell the viewers what you were telling me?
Oh, refresh my memory. Which subject?
About the Pentagon, about the plane going into the Pentagon, and about the other terrorists that took over the planes that crashed into the Twin Towers.
Here's the interesting thing. If you look at the circumstances around 9/11, there's a lot of questions, other than just the fact that the Twin Towers came down. The first thing is, right first in the morning, the U.S. Air Force is running a drill, and they have control over all of the radar stations in the Northeast because of their exercise that they're doing. So the FFA is no longer in control of any radar. The U.S. Air Force is. Now, there's a couple of anomalies that go on here. And anybody that listened to the report and can remember the news reports that were coming in, we first heard about the one tower getting hit, and then the other tower got hit, and then there was a news report that the Capitol got hit, and then there was a news report, and then they retracted that one. They said, oh no, first it came out that there was an explosion on Capitol Hill, and then they retracted that one, and they said, no, the Pentagon got hit. Well, wait a minute. Who's releasing this information? Who told us that there was an explosion on Capitol Hill when there wasn't any? What happened to that plane that crash landed out in Pennsylvania? The one that didn't make it? Where was that headed to? Maybe the Capitol building? Now, before 9/11, Donald Rumsfeld was facing an inquisition by Congress, and they wanted to know what the military did with $6 trillion. Where did $6 trillion disappear to? And here's the interesting thing about the Pentagon. It just so happened that whatever hit the Pentagon hit it right in accounting, burned up all the records. Donald Rumsfeld didn't have to say anything else to Congress now, did he? Because there was no record of anything that ever happened, and all the records to account for that $6 trillion were just incinerated. Now, if you look at the early pictures, the first pictures of the Pentagon after it was hit, you see a hole which is way too small for the size jet that they said that hit the Pentagon to hit the Pentagon. The other thing is, where did the wings go? If you look at the size of the hole, you can go on Google search and go look for the images. The typical image that they show is the whole facade of the Pentagon collapsed. There's very few pictures of the initial hole. And when you look at this, you say, this plane, I forget, what was it, which aircraft actually hit the Pentagon? Was it 767 or I forget the actual model number, but it was a sizable plane that they claimed.
Yeah.
Well, if it was that big, how did it fit in the hole, and where did the wings go? Explain that to me. Because when you look at the debris, the debris doesn't look like any major airline, any major aircraft hit that building. So you have to raise the question, was it a cruise missile or something much smaller packed with enough explosive which hit it? Unanswered question. There's no evidence left. All the evidence has been done away with. Interestingly enough, and regardless of what any of the listeners think about Jesse Ventura one way or the other, but they just did they actually did a conspiracy theory. It replayed last night. I just happened to catch it, but it was on. Oh shucks. Last night was actually particle beam weapons was the first one. It's one of the new episodes. They were talking about particle beam weapons or energy pulse weapons. And there's a theory that says that the World Trade Center was actually hit with an energy disrupting beam, where a beam hit the Pentagon to make it, the beam hit the Twin Towers to make them collapse. They say that there's, I forgot, was it 60 floors of debris seem to be missing?
No, I didn't hear that.
Yeah, it was an interesting calculation. They calculated the amount of debris that should have been there, and there's like 60 floors of debris that are just missing. Now, something that I did see, it was about 2 years ago. I had heard some information, maybe a little bit wrong, but I heard some information that they found Nimrod's tomb under the Euphrates River. And so I got on my search engine and started doing a search for alien weapons in Iraq. And the reason why is that allegedly in Nimrod's tomb, they found what they believed to be alien weapons. And the whole reason we went over there into war was, remember, was the weapons of mass destruction.
Yeah, that was never found.
Yeah, well, nobody ever talked about what they took out of Nimrod's tomb under the Euphrates River. But I get a hit back that seems to be kind of interesting. And it's a YouTube video. So I click on it, I'm looking at it, and there's, you can see two people sitting in a Humvee. This is somewhere in Afghanistan. And there's actually three people in the Humvee. One person is calling in coordinates. The first person is filming this with a video camera, maybe a cell phone, whatever he had to videotape it. And there's a third person in the back seat. You hear him say, "Watch this." And they're filming this tank that's out in the middle of the desert. And it's a Russian-made tank. All of a sudden, this bolt of light comes out of the sky and hits the tank, and it disintegrates the tank right on the spot. Mm-hmm. Now, the amazing thing is that you can see the barrel of the tank sticking out, and it turns to dust.
Oh my God!
It looks like smoke.
Oh my God!
So my only thought, this has to be some advanced weapon that we have, and it's interesting, I believe it was in October, Henry Kissinger, somebody interviewed Henry Kissinger, and he said two very interesting things. He said, control the oil and you can control nations. He said, but control the food and you can control people. The other thing that he said is that he's not worried about a war between the United States and Russia or the United States and China. He says, we have super weapons that, if should a war start, we have super weapons, the likes of which have never been seen before. And I'm thinking, could he be talking about this particle disruptor, this light energy that they can hit something with and totally destroy it? You never can tell.
You know, you also had another interesting point when we talked about this, about how these terrorists can take a couple of hours of flight lessons.
You know, here's another interesting caveat. You've got people that came over, and I'm not saying that when I talk about it, I talk about cavemen with box cutters turned around and hijacked airplanes. It's a little bit more sophisticated than that. That's a little oversimplification. But here, to become a pilot and fly one of these aircraft, you have to go through at least 4 years of flight school. And then you've got to go through months of training before you can turn around and actually fly one of these things, unless you're extremely gifted. The people, the hijackers that were said to have flown these things, learned to fly Cessnas and Beechcrafts, very small aircraft that kids can fly, literally. So how do you go from flying one of these little planes, let's say you took 100 hours worth of lessons, how do you equate those 100 hours to flying a commercial airliner? There's no way. You got to learn all the buttons, gauges, and things to push and pull. It's not just a matter of steering the thing to where you want to go.
So what is your opinion then of the Twin Towers, of them crashing into the Twin Towers?
Well, I believe that they crashed into the Twin Towers. I mean, we've seen.
Well, I saw that.
And as a matter of fact, I have a friend of mine has a corner office in the Empire State Building. It's the southwest corner office. He had a ringside seat to the Twin Towers falling. That was a very brief conversation. You know, people saw the airliners hit. Okay. Were they radio-controlled airliners following a GPS coordinates the same way we program a cruise missile? You see, you can't rule any of this stuff out. There's just too much coincidence saying that, hey, there was more behind this than meets the eye.
Yeah.
And anybody who doesn't look at the evidence that's there, this is just circumstantial.
Yeah. But the thing about
too many odd things.
But I just have a little insy-bincy problem with that, because this airline was scheduled. It was a commuter plane. These people boarded this commuter plane, so they triggered this. They set this plane up for that to happen on purpose. They just happened to pick out this particular plane, this flight.
If anybody was on that plane, unfortunately, they chose the wrong plane to get on that morning. Now you say, "Oh, how horrific! Why, so many people died in this." Wait a minute. Didn't we drop bombs on Fukushima, and didn't we drop, not Fukushima, Nagasaki and somebody dropped a bomb on Fukushima, that's for sure. Yeah. Nagasaki and I forget the other one now. Boy, I hate when that happens, it just slips my memory. But here's some things. During the Second World War, the cities of Tokyo and Dresden were burned to the ground. Over 250,000 people lost their lives in Tokyo. Literally burned to the ground with napalm. Yeah. There were firestorms there. We have the 20th century was the bloodiest century ever. It's possible that due to war and war-related issues, almost 1 billion people died in the 20th century. Now we get the statistics from the wars, but what we don't get is the famine, the disease and death that happened after the war. What we don't get is the reports from the regime changes. People jump up and down over Adolf Hitler killing 6 million Jews. A horrific thing, absolutely horrific. But what we never jump up and down over is that the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, between the Bolshevik Revolution and Stalin, it's over 50 million when they stopped counting. The number may be as high as 100 million people were killed during the purges of Russia. When you go to China, that number grows to as many as 600 million. Just do the percentages in Cambodia. A lot of people might remember the killing fields from Cambodia when the Pol Pot regime came in. A third of the country of Cambodia was killed, purposely killed, because of a regime change. So these little things aren't added in, but when you start adding all of the deaths from war, from regime changes, from the problems that come after as far as food shortage and disease, the number comes close to approaching 1 billion people dying in the 20th century, all because of the greed of bankers. Mm. If you don't believe that, here's some interesting statistics. Woodrow Wilson, who tried to, quote, keep us out of the First World War, he actually let the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve was thrown out previously by Andrew Jackson. The first time the Federal Reserve was actually got its start as the first Bank of America back in the 1700s. When the charter came up for renewal in 1811, Congress denied the Rothschild Bank their charter. You know what happened in 1812? We had a war. It's called the War of 1812. What started the War of 1812? I bet you could ask 100 people that question and nobody will have the correct answer. The correct answer is that we didn't give the Rothschild, that Congress didn't give the Rothschilds their charter. They turned to the King of England and went and financed the Royal Army to come to America to take back the colonies. The Rothschilds actually financed it. Mm. So now the War of 1812 ended in 1815. You know what Congress did in 1816? It ended in a stalemate too, interestingly enough. But what happened in 1816 is that Congress gave the Rothschild their banking charter, and the Second Bank of America was opened in the United States, which lasted until Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson kicked them back out. Interestingly enough, there was 3 assassination attempts on Jackson's life. And they stayed out pretty much. They did form partnerships with other banks in the United States. But let's fast forward up to the Depression. We hit the Depression in 1929. Money dried up, 25% of the population was out of work. Sounds a little familiar, doesn't it? What happens in 1933 is, in the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt comes to power, and in Germany, who's even had a worse depression, Adolf Hitler comes to power. And now Franklin turns around and sparks his New Deal that's going on. And one of the first things that he does, remember, you know, like just Obama signed the executive orders, the AADH bill, and these different executive orders, which essentially have taken away all of our freedoms, and now we have no right to our own personal possessions by the presidential proclamations, essentially, his executive orders. Well, back in 1933, Roosevelt signed an executive order which made it illegal for all Americans to own more than $100 in gold. Gold was trading at $20.67 an ounce in 1933. Anything in excess of that had to be sold to the Treasury. Well, the Federal Reserve actually bought the gold. They bought over 500 tons of gold at the cost of $380 billion at $20.67 an ounce. A year later, Roosevelt turned around and changed the strike price of gold from $20.67 an ounce to $35 an ounce. The American dollar was devalued by 40%, and the Rothschild family just made 40% on their investment in a year. Mm-hmm. That money was then taken and used to finance the New Deal projects that came in under Roosevelt, the Tennessee Valley Authority, the Hoover Dam, where they were building hydroelectric plants. Now, by the time the Second World War started, I believe there was 22 hydroelectric dams that were built outside, around Knoxville, Tennessee, and in through the Smoky Mountains. 2 of the biggest electricity users opened up. The first one that opened up was the Alcoa aluminum plant, which is in Alcoa, Tennessee. The world's largest aluminum plant opened up. They need massive amounts of electricity. And the next thing that opened up, which uses massive amounts of electricity, is Oak Ridge Nuclear Laboratories. This was planned from 1933. This was actually planned before Roosevelt was even put into office. So they used this money that was stolen, or this gold that was stolen from the people of the United States, to finance the Second World War, which resulted in the deaths of over 55 million people. Yeah. Talk about a sacrifice. Now, why did they do it? Oh, well, you need to go back to prior to the First World War to find this out. Just before the First World War broke out, the Balfour Agreement was started at the bequest of the Rothschild family, who got Lord Balfour to agree that that the Jews should have a homeland and that it should be Palestine. Now, the English controlled Palestine at this time. Well, now you needed to get a population to go back to their homeland. Interestingly enough, most of the Jewish population lived in Europe. And so persecution breaks out against the Jewish population. Now, 6 million Jews were put to death in what's called the Holocaust. The word Holocaust is most interesting. It means whole burnt offering. It's what Molech required. Molech required the whole burnt offering of children. And yes, we saw the children of Israel burned during the Holocaust to the tune of 16 million. And so there was an offering, a whole burnt offering to the gods of the Rothschild family and their cabal. And what did that Holocaust bring in? Oh, well, after the war ended, after the Second World War ended, we have the United Nations, which springs out. It used to be known after the Second World War as the League of Nations, which the United States didn't ever join. But we joined the United Nations. And the first thing that the United Nations did was declare Israel the homeland for the Jews. Well, you know, nice, but how do you get a bunch of Jewish people to move from very wooded northern areas back down to the desert? You got to give them an incentive. Persecution was the incentive.
Wow, I'm exhausted. You're so full of information.
This all comes back to the same thing. Remember when we talked about Molech worshippers from the book of Acts, Acts 7, 42 and 43? You see, this same group of people, Stephen said it was during the wilderness that when the nation of Israel was in the wilderness. Well, where did they come from? Well, they just got out of Egypt. So they brought the same Egyptian gods with them, and they were secretly worshiping these Egyptian gods, and they did so all throughout their history. Right, it happened when Jerusalem or Judea was destroyed by the Babylonians around 600 BC. It was because of Molech worship and Baal worship that they were involved in, is why the nation was destroyed. And so that was the prophecy from Amos, or one of them anyway. And then Stephen says the same thing in the first century. And what happens in 70? The Roman armies come in 70 and they destroy Jerusalem again, and they take back about 2 million. According to the historian Josephus, about 2 million Jews were put to death in Jerusalem. Josephus said that the blood ran in the streets so much that it literally put out fires.
Oh my God.
After that bloodletting, they took back, which you could figure was probably the elite, the highest level of rulers would actually be the best protected from Jerusalem, and they hold them back as slaves to Rome. But now what history doesn't tell you is that by the end of the first century, most of those slaves who were Hebrew slaves or Jewish slaves had bought their way out of slavery and assimilated into European society. 300 years later, the church comes about. And so now you get this influence of these same elite rulers of Jerusalem seem to work their way into the elite rulership of Europe, including the church and the different countries and the monarchies.
Wow.
And this is minorly documented because you have to remember the persecution of the church to non-Jews. To non-Christians, to those who were Jewish or Islamic after Islam came about. Those people were persecuted as heretics. They were burned to death, pulled apart, ripped in half, whatever the case might be. They were severely persecuted. And then you have 1,000 years after the destruction of Jerusalem, all of a sudden there's a reason to go back to the Middle East. And the Knights Templar go back to the Middle East. They recapture Jerusalem. Only they do a worse job than the Romans did. They killed everybody, man, woman, child, Christian, Jew, Muslim. It didn't make any difference. If they were in Jerusalem, they were put to the sword. And then they started digging under the temple. What were they digging? How did they know to dig? Well, that's the first question. How did they know there was something worth digging for? Because if you look at the Arch of Titus, which stands in Rome still today, which depicts the whole destruction of Jerusalem and the capture and the bringing back of all of the people and the booty or the prizes that they got, all the looting that they did, that's all pictured on the Arch of Titus. So there was really nothing left to go dig for. Oh, how did they know to dig? How did they know there was something there? Unless their ancestors were there to bury something. Bury something before the Romans did.
Peter, I'm gonna have to end this. Can you wrap up that, so, because we gotta end this.
Sure. So what happens here is that whatever they find, it may be wealth, but more than likely it's knowledge, because Europe is then transformed from wood into stone edifices. We have castles built. This is where all of these cathedrals come out from, and we have the what seems to be an odd situation. The Knights Templar grow to the second most powerful entity in Europe, next to the Catholic Church, and then the Church does away with the Knights Templar, but they don't really go away. They stay around in Freemasonry. And then there's the Illuminati movement that's financed by the Rothschilds. And then you have all the manipulations of the governments taking place, and it's all recorded in history. And these same families are still ruling the world today, and they are all Luciferians.
Wow.
They are controlling our government. Wherever there's money, they're controlling it. They own it. And so that's what we're facing. And so when we look at where we are on the cusp of great change. This system of evil, this system where we've had alien involvement to our detriment over the years, over the centuries, and the detriment of those who are ruling us, the ruling class over the centuries, and these people don't care anything about us. Look at the Georgia Guidestones. They want to reduce the Earth's population to 500 million.
Yeah. You know, one of the viewers wants you to, they want to know if you've ever seen the movie Thrive Movement. And if you haven't, they're recommending that you watch that. Thrive Movement.
I have not seen it, and yes, I will watch it. Thank you. Thank you for the recommendation.
Oh, God, I'm exhausted. They loved you.
I'm gonna finish this up here real quick for everybody. So here's where we are in the stream of time. We're looking at prophecies that are obviously being fulfilled. Yep, it's my interpretation. You know, take it any way that you want. Look at it though. It's logical. It fits. It's like it fits better than OJ's glove did. And here we are. We look around us. We see these banking cabals. We see the illegitimate. There's all sorts of questions about about this past election. Was there election fraud? There's lots of evidence that alleges that there is. We see situations like Sandy being controlled by super weapons. Interestingly enough, that with all the seismic activity that can be tracked inland as Sandy is going up the coast, they don't care about us. We hear reports about FEMA camps. We hear reports about the TSA and almost every government agency buying up all sorts of ammunition. They're getting ready for something. What are they getting ready for? You have to wonder. So we're right at this cusp. Now, we're on a dual timeline. See, there's a timeline that's positive and there's a timeline that's catastrophic. The rulers of this world want to have us on the timeline that's catastrophic. But if we stay positive, if we keep ourselves in harmony and if we keep ourselves in love, you know, nothing kills fear faster than love, and nothing will kill love faster than fear. So, you know, we have to start to pay attention to these things which are talked about in the scriptures because they're put there for a reason. And as long as we can keep ourselves in a state of love, if we're showing that we care for our fellow man, if we care for our neighbors, if we have that close family relationship, if we put down our anger and start loving, we'll be much better off. We'll be much better off internally, and we'll be much better off as a civilization. And when they start to collapse this system, we'll be ready for a change because we know it's coming. But we need to stay positive. We need to stay awake. We need to pay attention to these things. And when it happens, we may very well see this planet could very well be turned into battlefield Earth between picture Star Wars. There's more truth in Star Wars than anything the church will ever tell us. We are caught between two rival factions, the loyalist faction and the rebel faction. The rebel faction has control of this planet right now, and it's led by Lucifer. According to the scriptures, they're going to be cleaned up and taken away. And then this earth will start to be regenerated. Now here's where the photon belt comes into play.
Peter, I'm not going to be able to get this on YouTube.
Okay. So my point is, we have a very positive future. We are at the cusp of change. We need to stay awake. And with that, I'll say love and blessings to everyone. Join me on Facebook. Go to my webpage, www.peterkling.com. Pick up the book. You can actually download it tonight as a PDF file for $5 and start reading it tonight. It's a lot of great information. Most of it we talked about tonight. There's still a lot there. There's a lot of nuts and bolts.
I still had a lot of questions that we didn't touch on. So with that note, I would like to bring you back next year.
Well, let's hope that there is a next year to come back to.
Come on! Peter, everybody...
I say that tongue in cheek because we do have some things that we have to get past. And hopefully we can all stay safe and all stay in a state of... excuse me. All stay in a state of love. And yes, I'd be more than happy to come back. Next year's only 8 weeks away.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you so much for being my guest tonight. Everybody loved you. You're just... I mean, it's just the information you have is awesome. Viewers, thank you so much for joining me tonight and sticking with the 2 hours. Actually, it's over 2 hours. So this will be archived, and thank you so much, everybody. Peter, good night. Good night, everyone. See you next Thursday. Thank you. Good night. Say good night, Peter.
Good night. Love and blessings to everyone. Have a great evening. Thank you for listening.